Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at China-Russia relations, and we've got this really interesting article from the Council on Foreign Relations from November 22nd of 2024. And yeah, we're really going to kind of dig into this and try to unpack some of the complexities of this relationship.
Yeah, it's certainly a fascinating and really complex dynamic that we're seeing play out right now.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is really interesting is this whole backdrop of the situation in Ukraine,
Absolutely.
with North Korean troops now being deployed.
Right.
And the U.S. and its allies are really kind of looking to China to step in and use its influence to de-escalate the situation.
Yeah, they're really looking to China to be that kind of responsible player on the global stage and to leverage their relationship with both Russia and North Korea to try and bring some stability to this really volatile situation.
Right. And the article makes this point that China's saying all the right things. You know, they're talking about peace and stability,
Mm-hmm.
but their actions seem to be telling a bit of a different story.
Yeah, there's definitely this disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality. We see China presenting itself as a neutral arbiter, trying to promote dialogue and peaceful resolution. But at the same time, they're also deepening their diplomatic and military cooperation with Russia.
So it's kind of like they're playing both sides a little bit.
It does appear that way. I
Yeah.
mean, just look that recent military showcase that China hosted. They had top Russian security officials in attendance,
Oh, wow.
checking out the latest Chinese and Russian military hardware. So clearly there's a very strong and growing military dimension to this partnership.
So they're kind of saying one thing to the West, but then kind of cozying up to Russia in the background.
Yeah, and I think part of this has to do with China's very delicate balancing act that they have to maintain. On the one hand, they need to maintain good relations with the West for economic reasons. But on the other hand, they also can't afford to alienate Russia.
Especially in this kind of geopolitical climate.
Exactly. So
Oh,
they're
yeah.
trying to walk this very fine line.
And it's interesting because the article also talks about that meeting between Biden and Xi at the APEC summit back in November.
Yeah.
And, they talk about the need for a stable relationship.
Right.
But, I imagine that conversation probably had some awkward silences.
I would imagine so. I mean, there's so many points of tension between the U.S. and China right now, Taiwan being a major one, of course, but also the issue of Chinese support for Russia, their activities in the South China Sea, cyber espionage. All these things are major sticking points that are constantly simmering beneath the surface.
Right. And then to kind of complicate things even further, you have Putin coming out in early November with that statement on Taiwan.
Yeah.
Where he basically reiterated Russia's, strong ties with China, their support for China's claim over Taiwan. And he even went so far as to accuse Taiwan of stirring up trouble in Asia.
Mm.
What do you think the thinking was behind that statement?
Well, I think the timing is certainly interesting. It came just a few weeks before the APEC summit, almost as if Putin was trying to send a message to the U.S. and its allies, sort of a "we've got each other's backs" kind of message.
Right.
Really reinforcing that united front between Moscow and Beijing.
Right. So kind of a show of force in a way.
Exactly. A way of showing that they're standing together in the face of what they perceive as Western pressure.
Okay, so let's go back to those North Korean troops in Ukraine. The article says that the U.S. is putting a lot of pressure on China to intervene using their influence with both North Korea and Russia to try and de-escalate the situation. Do you think this is a realistic expectation?
Well, it's certainly a very delicate situation for China. They're being put in a very difficult position.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they don't want to see further destabilization in the region,
Right.
and they're definitely wary of increased European involvement in East Asian security, especially when it comes to Taiwan.
That makes sense.
But at the same time, they can't afford to alienate Russia or appear to be bowing to U.S. pressure. So it's a real geopolitical tightrope walk for them.
And it wasn't just the U.S. that was urging China to act.
Right.
The article mentions that NATO and the EU were also applying pressure. So China was really feeling the heat from the international community.
You were definitely in the hot seat. And their response to that pressure, I think, is very telling. We'll get into that in just a moment.
Okay, so stay tuned, everyone, because we're going to be getting into China's response to all this pressure in part 2 of our deep dive into China-Russia relations. So with all that pressure, how did China actually respond? I mean, did they try to, rein in Russia and North Korea?
It's interesting because they didn't really cave to the pressure. In fact, at the G20 summit, we saw the Chinese and Russian foreign ministers, Wang Yi and Lavrov, they had this meeting and they reaffirmed their strong relationship. It was almost like a deliberate snub, to the international community.
Yeah, it's like, you think with the U.S. now authorizing Ukraine to use long-range missiles that can hit Russian territory, you would think China might be a little bit hesitant to be so publicly aligned with Russia.
You would think so. But, even at that same G20 summit, Xi Jinping called for a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Ukraine.
Ah,
And then later in the month, he doubled down on that stance during a meeting with Brazil's president.
so they're really sticking to this line of, presenting themselves as this responsible global leader.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very careful game that they're playing, trying to kind of come across as neutral while at the same time, not completely alienating their Russian ally.
It's interesting, too, because the article points out how China sanctioned a U.S. drone maker, Skydio, for supplying Ukraine.
Right.
But at the same time, they're in talks to open up agricultural exports from Ukraine. So it's like they're trying to play both sides.
Yeah, it's a classic example of what's often called strategic ambiguity,
Right.
right? Avoiding firm commitments,
Yeah.
keeping their options open, playing both sides. It's a high-risk strategy, but for now, it seems to be working for them.
So how effective do you think this approach can be in the long run? I mean, could it backfire on them at some point?
Well, it's definitely a gamble. If they push it too far, they risk alienating both sides and ending up isolated on the global stage. But for now, they seem to be managing it fairly skillfully.
To make things even more interesting, the new Chinese ambassador to Ukraine has been emphasizing the strong traditional ties between their two countries.
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying to send this subtle message to Ukraine that, they haven't been forgotten amidst all this focus on Russia.
Yeah, like, hey, we're still here.
Exactly, right? We still value our relationship. So, it's just another layer of this very complex geopolitical dance that they're engaged in.
Okay, so we've got this picture of China trying to carefully navigate this relationship with Russia while also under pressure from the West. But I want to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture here. What are the larger implications of all of this? I mean, the article suggests there's some pretty significant global consequences at play here.
Oh, absolutely. This is about much more than just, regional power struggles. This is about a potential reshaping of the entire international order.
Wow.
We're moving away from this era of unipolarity where the U.S. was the dominant global power. And we're entering a new phase of multipolarity where China and Russia are increasingly challenging that dominance.
So a more fragmented world.
Potentially, yes. And, this shift in the balance of power has some pretty major consequences. For one thing, it highlights the increasing importance of alliances and partnerships. No single country can go it alone in this new multipolar world. The U.S. needs its allies, and China and Russia are working to build their own networks of influence.
It's like a giant game of chess.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Everyone's trying to make strategic moves to gain an advantage.
And of course, one of the key pieces on that chessboard is Taiwan.
Absolutely. Which, as we know, is a major flashpoint in U.S.-China relations.
Right. And Russia's very vocal support for China's claim over Taiwan just adds fuel to the fire.
Exactly. It's a calculated move, a way of testing the limits of U.S. resolve and potentially driving a wedge between the U.S. and its allies in the region.
So how is the U.S. responding to all of this? Are they just sitting back and watching this new world order unfold? Or are they taking action?
Well, the U.S. is definitely not sitting on the sidelines.
Yeah.
They're employing a combination of diplomatic pressure and military posturing. On the diplomatic front, they're trying to rally their allies to present a united front against both China and Russia. We've seen increased cooperation with countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and they're also working to strengthen ties with European partners.
And what about on the military side? Are we seeing any shifts there?
Well, the U.S. has been stepping up its military presence in the Indo-Pacific region, conducting joint military exercises, deploying advanced weapons systems. It's a clear message to China that they're not backing down or are prepared to defend their interests in the region.
It sounds like we're heading into a period of heightened tension and potentially even conflict. It's a little nerve-wracking, to be honest.
I understand the concern. The situation is incredibly volatile, and there's a real risk of miscalculation that could lead to a dangerous escalation. But it's important to remember that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope. By staying informed and engaged, we can hopefully contribute to a more peaceful and stable world.
Yeah, I like that sentiment. Knowledge is power, right? And that's what we're trying to do here, to understand the forces that are shaping our world so that we can make more informed decisions and maybe even help avoid those worst-case scenarios.
Exactly. We need to understand not only what's happening, but also why it matters. And in this case, the implications of this China-Russia partnership go far beyond just those two countries. It has the potential to impact all of us, regardless of where we live.
So it's not just an academic exercise or something we can just, kind of ignore and hope it goes away.
Not at all. It's about understanding the forces shaping our world and being active participants in the conversations that will ultimately determine our future.
And that's where informed citizens like you come in,
Hmm.
right? The article really underscores the importance of staying informed and engaged. We can hold our leaders accountable, advocate for policies that promote peace and stability, and work to build a better world for everyone.
Absolutely. It's a daunting task, but it's one that's absolutely crucial if we want to create a more just and equitable future.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, I wanted to circle back to a point that really resonated with me from the article. They mentioned China's sanctions on Skydio, that U.S. drone maker.
Hmm.
And it just made me think about how technology is becoming increasingly intertwined with geopolitics.
Yeah, it's a crucial point. We're entering this new era of technological competition where countries are vying for dominance in areas like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology. These aren't just abstract concepts. They have the potential to reshape the global landscape in really profound ways. Whoever controls these technologies will wield significant economic and military power.
It's like a new kind of arms race.
Yeah,
But instead of stockpiling weapons, countries are competing for technological supremacy.
precisely. And the stakes are incredibly high. The choices that we make today as individuals, as nations, will have a ripple effect for generations to come.
So it's really up to all of us to be informed, engaged, and proactive in shaping the world that we want to live in. We need to think critically, ask tough questions, and demand accountability from our leaders.
I couldn't agree more. It's a challenging but also very exciting time to be alive. The decisions that we make now will determine the course of history.
That's a powerful thought. And on that note, we're going to wrap up part 2 of our deep dive into China-Russia relations. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll bring it all together and leave you with some final thoughts to ponder. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into China-Russia relations. And man, it's been a lot to unpack.
It really has a lot of moving pieces.
Definitely a complex situation. I keep thinking back to those North Korean troops in Ukraine. It just seems to add this whole other layer of unpredictability to an already volatile situation.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because as we've been talking about, China's role in all of this has been really fascinating to watch. This whole idea of strategic ambiguity that they've been employing, it's really quite masterful.
Yeah, I mean, they're walking this incredibly fine line, trying to maximize their influence
Mhm.
without fully committing to one side or the other.
Exactly. And it's a high risk, high reward strategy, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's really keeping the world guessing.
Mm.
Will they continue to support Russia, even if it means, damaging their relationships with the West? Or will they eventually prioritize their economic interests and kind of distance themselves from Moscow?
That's the million-dollar question. And I don't think anyone has a clear answer at this point. But what we're seeing is a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. And that's creating a lot of uncertainty, a lot of potential for miscalculation.
So if we're moving toward this multipolar world, as the article suggests, what does that actually mean for the average person?
Hmm.
Why should we care about these power struggles that are happening on the other side of the world?
That's a great question. And it's easy to feel disconnected from these global events. But the reality is that they have the potential to impact every single one of us. The global economy, international security, even our personal freedoms. All of these things can be affected by the choices that these major powers are making.
So this isn't just something that we can ignore and hope it goes away.
Exactly. The world is becoming increasingly interconnected. What happens in one part of the world inevitably ripples out and affects us all. We need to be aware of these dynamics to understand the forces at play so we can make informed decisions and participate in shaping the kind of future that we want.
That reminds me of something that we touched on earlier, this idea of technological competition between nations. The article mentioned China's sanctions on Skydio, that U.S. drone maker. And it just made me think about how technology is becoming this new battleground in global power struggles.
Absolutely. I mean, this isn't your grandfather's Cold War anymore. The competition is playing out in the realms of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology. Whoever controls these emerging technologies will have a huge advantage.
It's almost like a new arms race.
Mhm.
But instead of stockpiling weapons, countries are racing to achieve technological dominance.
Precisely. And the stakes are incredibly high. The choices that we make today as individuals, as nations, will have a ripple effect for generations to come.
So what can we do? How can we as individuals make a difference in all of this? It feels overwhelming sometimes.
I know it can feel that way. But I think the most important thing is to stay informed and engaged. Educate yourself about the issues, be critical of the information that you're consuming, and don't be afraid to engage in thoughtful dialogue with others, even those who hold different viewpoints.
It's about being an active and informed citizen, not just a passive observer.
Exactly. And remember, every voice matters. By speaking up, by holding our leaders accountable, by demanding a better future, we can collectively create a more just and equitable world.
I love that. Like a call to action, a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future.
I hope that's the message our listeners take away from this deep dive. It's not about despair, it's about empowerment. We have the power to shape the world that we want to live in.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. It's a question that's been kind of simmering throughout our conversation. And it's one that I think will continue to define this geopolitical landscape for years to come.
What's that?
How long can China maintain this balancing act? And what happens if one side tips the scales?
That's the question, isn't it? The answer is far from clear, but one thing is certain, the world is watching and the stakes are incredibly high.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Join the conversation on our social media channels. And let's continue to explore these complex issues together. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.